Very pleased to have the honor today to introduce Dr. Gerd Gigerenzer. Due to his long list of achievements, this might take a while, but it's here. As you all know, Dr. Gigerenzer is the director of the Center for Adaptive Behavior and Cognition here at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, and he's also the director of the Harding Center for Risk Literacy. Some of Dr. Gigerenzer's former academic positions include Professor of Psychology at the University of Chicago and the M. Olin Distinguished Visiting Professor at the School of Law at the University of Virginia. Dr. Gigerenzer has had an exceptional career, and his scholarly contributions have been recognized in the form of numerous prestigious awards, including the American Association for the Advancement of Science Prize Award for the Best Article in the Behavioral Sciences, the Association of American Publishers Prize for the Best Book in the Social and Behavioral Sciences, fellowship status of the Association for Psychological Science for his distinguished contributions to psychological science, as well as numerous honorary doctorates, the German Psychology Prize and the Communicator Award for the German Research Association, just to name a few. What perhaps is less known to today's audience is how Dr. Gigerenzer became interested in the topic of decision-making and risk. In a recent interview with The Economist, Dr. Gigerenzer notes that when he was a graduate student, he was earning good money as a banjo player, and he had to choose between music and going into academia. And this personal experience taught him that you can calculate risk when you play roulette in a casino, but not usually in the real world. That's when you have to use your intuition, or your rule of thumb, which for him was find out what you find most important and just go with it. And for Dr. Gigerenzer, that was academia. Unlike many economists who unfortunately don't use utility maximization as a personal philosophy in life, it seems that Dr. Gigerenzer has, in fact, used his own strategy to make decisions in life. For those interested, there's a YouTube video of Dr. Gigerenzer's band online where he can be found playing the banjo. Dr. Gigerenzer significantly advanced the scientific literature on unconscious decision-making and the inner workings of intuitions and heuristics, how they operate, and under what environmental conditions they are adaptive. With his esteemed colleagues, he has pioneered the concepts of social and ecological rationality and has published numerous award-winning books. Too many to mention, but a few of them include Simple Heuristics That Make Us Smart, Bounded Rationality, The Adaptive Toolbox, Reckoning with Risk, Learning to Live with Uncertainty, Gut Feelings, The Intelligence of the Unconscious, more recently, Better Doctors, Better Patients, Better Decisions, Envisioning Healthcare 2020, and Heuristics, The Foundations of Adaptive Behavior. I'll end with, I recently reread some passages of the Adaptive Toolbox, and my favorite part is near the end, where Dr. Gigerenzer describes one day where he went to the library to scan over some old experimental psychology journals. And he notes that he became quite depressed after reading them, not because they were old or uninteresting or anything like that, but because of the realization that much of modern social psychology lacks good theory. And as Dr. Gigerenzer describes it, good data without good theories are like babies without parents. Their life expectancy is quite low. And I always thought about that. I think it's an interesting point. It's true, there are increasingly few revolutionizing theories in social psychology. Today, much is about writing interesting experimental papers without any substantial theories that are likely to be forgotten many years from now. So this is part of the reason why I'm here today, to learn more about the theories in the cutting-edge research program that's been advanced for many years here at the Max Planck Institute. And I realize that no one is here to hear me give a jabber. So without further ado, I introduce Professor Gerd Gigerenzer.
Welcome to the Summer Institute. Ralph and I have been lucky to have wonderful students, and this just is another generation of them. Students who dare to know, students who dare to think, students who dare to ask questions, and students who question us. So, all the years at ABC, where I was part, have been questions all the time, and learn from my own students. So what I present today is an overview about research, which deals with the question that is up there. The question is by Herbert Simon. Herbert Simon is known as the father of Bounded Rationality, and he asked, how do human beings reason when the conditions for rationality postulated by the model of neoclassical economics are not met? just to start with, this is a question that is not often posed. And we ask this question, and in addition, the normative question, namely, how should human beings reason when these conditions are not met? That is, when you can't optimize. This question is almost never being asked. And the goal of our research is to develop a positive alternative to expected utility maximization and to Bayesian statistics, which works in a world where you can predict the risks, but it's up in the air in a world of uncertainty, and at the same time not to ignore the statistical approaches that work very well in a world of risk. So today, what I will do with you is to make you think. This is much more about asking the right questions than about finding the answers, at least this talk. And so here is one question. And the first important distinction is between risk and uncertainty. A distinction that has been made in various forms through the last centuries, but it's probably the one distinction that has been ignored most of the time. A typical economics book starts with the distinction as it was phrased by Frank Knight, an economist, only then to ignore uncertainty and go on with risk. There are a few exceptions, but that's typical. So what is this distinction? In risk, the question is, how should we make decisions when all relevant alternatives, all the consequences and all the probabilities are known or can be reliably estimated? So if you are spending this evening in a casino in Berlin and play the roulette, then you can calculate how much you will probably lose in the long run. You don't need any rules of thumb. And in this world, rules of thumb are not the best thing to do. And you also don't need any intuition. You just lose your money, or hope. There are a number of problems which are of that kind, not just playing the roulette. On Friday, you will hear a talk by Odette Wekwart from the Harding Center for Risk Literacy, and she will talk about how to help doctors to understand evidence in medicine, statistical evidence. So here is the place for risk and risk communication. And you may learn, by the way, that most doctors never learn how to understand probabilities. So please help us in our effort to teach doctors, in case you visit a doctor. The rest of this talk will be on uncertainty and also on the confusion of risk with uncertainty. And here the question is a different one. How should we make decisions when not all alternatives, consequences, or probabilities are known? So that goes beyond the Frank Knight definition, which is about where the probabilities are not known. In many situations, you don't know the consequences. So how did you make the decision about your partner or whom to marry? Did you sit down and do the pro and con list and estimate the probabilities for each of the alternatives that the things will net? Very few people do that. And here's a situation where we do not know all the consequences. We cannot know. There's interaction. The behavior of the other one is not just caused by some traits of the other one, but by us and the perception of what we do. And here we need more in this situation. And these situations are most of the situations we deal with. Where to invest your money? What to do with the rest of your life? Whether to attend a summer school or not? What kind of theories? What are you going to do in your scientific career? how to choose between being on the stage or in academia. That's all this kind of decision. By the way, thanks for the kind introduction, but I really didn't maximize my expected utility. I have no utilities. I was just going for the one best reason in my decision, whether to stay on the stage and play music or to go academia, which was, I wanted to be free. And you are not free. For every one of you who has been in the entertainment music business, you have to play what your audience wants. And in academia, I believe I can write whatever I believe, even if nobody wants to read it. You can't do that on the stage. You will be doomed. So that was much more one reason decision making, which is called a heuristic. You really can't calculate any probabilities in this situation. And trying to be a subjective Bayesian who makes up probabilities, that's a non-starter. Okay, so the question is, how can we develop a theoretical framework that deals with heuristics? And with heuristics in an interesting way, not in a derogative way, not in the sense that heuristics are the reason for all kind of disasters. Yeah? Okay. Yeah. Oh, that's how it worked. Huh? You put something on here and I touched it. It's not you. Okay. So, and what I will try to do today is to give you an overview about the questions, and in the next days we'll get lots of issues, debates, and also knowledge. Again, that's the question. This is now the descriptive question we want to ask them, and there are two important points that Herbert Simon made. First, we want to make process models. That means we want to make models about how people really make decisions, as opposed to as if. For those of you who are not economists, as if models are the way theorizing is done in economics. And it's important for you to understand the difference. What's an as if model? The most famous one is Ptolemy's model of the movement of the heavenly bodies. So the Earth is in the middle, and everyone else is in circles. Now, since that didn't yield very good predictions, the idea was to introduce epicircuits. So a circuit, and then you make this little loop, and then you go on. That yielded very good predictions. But that's an as-if model. Very few people believed that Mars would move like that, and maybe epicircuits. So that's about predictions. And much of economics is about prediction, and that's fine. The point is, there's another world where you might be interested in how do people actually make predictions, and the correspondence model for the heavenly bodies would be Copernicus's model, where the Earth is no longer in the center, but the Sun is in one of the centers of an ellipse, and everyone else is going in ellipses. This is still a model. It's not really true. No model is true. But it tries to capture the actual movements. And it's not just about prediction, but also about the actual movements. So, one of the tenets is try to model how people actually make decisions, not as if. The main motivation why so many psychologists and also philosophers and also economists make as-if models is because one likes to use a certain kind of mathematics, the differential calculus. That's the main motivation. And many people are rightly proud about how well they can handle that. Yeah? But that's not a different thing about trying to understand how humans make decisions. And the second point is try to make models for decisions under uncertainty, not only risk. We have a number of models for making decisions under risk. And we sometimes, in many fields, overdo it. And also present tasks to subjects in which everything is known, at least to the experimenter. The experimenter is God. There's no uncertainty. And you can only fail on this task. And the general point is that one can show, and I will give you some examples, that first, if you figure out how people make decisions under risk, that may not translate at all into how to make decisions under uncertainty. And second, and probably more interesting, the normative, the best solution under risk, does not necessarily translate into the best action in the real world. And for instance, when neuroeconomics tries to understand what's going on in the brain and presents people with, which is often the case, typically choices between gambles and nothing else, you cannot be sure that you learn anything about how the mind deals with uncertainty. Starting with these two distinctions, as-if models, process models, and uncertainty versus risk. And I mentioned these are polarities. There's lots in between. We can now understand three different visions of bounded rationality. Bounded rationality is not one of one kind, as it's usually presented. There are at least three totally different programs under the same term. And here are they. For most economists, bounded rationality means optimization under constraints. That's the idea of Homo economicus. I quote Ken Arrow, a Nobel laureate, who says, bounded rationality procedures are in fact fully optimal procedures when one takes account of the cost of computation. That's the under constraints part. Ken Arrow wrote that in a book that was published in the memory of the late Herbert Simon. Herbert Simon once told me that he wanted to sue people who misuse his term for optimization under constraints. He did not, and it's now too late. And here you see, nevertheless, it's just going on. And that's a way to explain why one doesn't need to deal with bounded rationality, because it's anyhow the same thing as we already have. The assumption is we are in a world of risk, and we can compute everything, and if we can't, then we can at least assume that people behave as if they would maximize some function consisting of utilities and subjective probabilities, and then we're out of the thing. And we can still use the same tool for every problem. It's the old story, if you have one hammer, if you have only a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Everything looks like utility maximization. One problem with that is that in the applied work, very few situations are where for any businessman, for any doctor, for any other people working out in the wild, utility maximization is of any help. You can always say after the fact, you maximize the utility by sitting in the first row. You maximized it by sitting in the last row. So, yes, that always works. But we need something that predicts and actually describes people. In the 1970s, an interesting counter-program came up, starting in psychology. It's the so-called cognitive illusions program, or heuristics and biases program, has many names, and it's about deviations from Homo economicus. So I quote Danny Kahneman, who says, our research attempted to obtain a map of bounded rationality. by exploring the systematic biases that separate the beliefs that people have and the choice they make from the optimal beliefs and choices assumed in rational agent models. Now, Kahneman uses the term bounded rationality for something that sounds like irrationality. It looks like the opposite from the economist's views. But, although it's the opposite in a descriptive way, as you see in this quote and in the research, that program is using the same norms, at least the same norms that the economists use. It's still about optimization. If you're rational, you use Bayes, you optimize, and any deviation from that is called a cognitive illusion. And I put a quote from Simon on the top here, where he says clearly, the study of bounded rationality is not the study of optimization. And we find it in Kahneman's words, it's now the deviation from optimization. Still, the assumption is that we are in a world of calculable risk. And then, of course, in his view, heuristics are always second best. But that holds only in the world of risk. So it's important that you understand these big questions that are being asked and how they differ, so to find your own position where you want to be. And the difference here is, here it's about risk and it's as if. And here it's about risk. And it's not as if one tries to model what people do, but people believe you still that optimization and rational choice here is always the best thing to do. The program that we have tried, and we're still trying to push and to develop, is about ecological rationality, and the Homo economicus turns into Homo heuristicus. And different from these two, so first, it's not about as if, so it's about process models. Second, the norms are different from both of you, because in the distinction between risk and uncertainty, in uncertainty, you can't, by definition, not optimize. So you need something else. And so the rationality is no longer something internal, like consistency or Bayes, but it's ecological rationality, meaning a heuristic. The study of ecological rationality is the study of the environments in which a given heuristic works. Simple example, many of us run on a heuristic which is trust your doctor, and you do whatever the doctor tells you to do. This heuristic is neither good nor bad. It's neither rational nor irrational per se. It's ecological rationality, that's the real question. Determine in what world or situation it's a good thing to do it, and in what world you should better maybe get statistics. And three of these features of these worlds are, if your doctor knows the evidence, so the statistical evidence, then trust your doctor is a good idea. If your doctor has no conflicts of interests, that means wants to sell you some treatment, not in order that you profit from it, but the clinic. So we have now a situation, particularly in the US, where surgeons are giving bonuses for the number of hysterectomies or prostatectomies or other surgeries they do on you. So that's conflicts of interest. And third, trust your doctor is a good idea if the doctor doesn't practice defensive medicine. That means protect yourself. Protect him or herself against you as a potential plaintiff. And advise you things to do, like unnecessary biopsies or CT scans that the doctor would never advise his own family. So that's the idea of ecological rationality. So it's about the question, given a certain heuristic, can we identify the world in which following this heuristic is normatively better than following some other strategy? Clear? Good. You might check your neighbors on this concept of ecological rationality. It seems so counterintuitive to many people. And it's always counterintuitive because one thinks that something is like God, the best thing. Yeah? But in ecological rationality, there is no God anymore. You need to figure out how something, a strategy, matches in the world, in the problem. The research program asks 3 questions. The first one is descriptive. What's in the adaptive toolbox? The second one is normative. So what's the ecological rationality? And the third one is engineering, practical. How can we use all of this to help experts to make better decisions? The Adaptive Toolbox program asks about what are these heuristics? How can we identify them experimentally? How can we classify them? Are there hundreds? Is it like the periodic table of elements? Do they consist from smaller parts? And here some of these parts we have identified are search rules, stopping rules, and decision rules. And you will see in the task by Thorsten Parkour that follows mine a number of examples. And most important, how do these heuristics and the building blocks use or exploit the cognitive capacities that you carry along? So, certain heuristics can only be used by humans, but not by, say, ants. And that's particular social heuristics. So, social imitation, that works. On the other hand, we know from many studies with animals that they use heuristics that we could never use because they have different cognitive capacities. So if an ant is trying to find out a new nest and it's going into a cavity and tries to estimate the area, it has no ruler, but it has a rule of thumb. And the rule of thumb is well known. It runs around randomly and leaves a pheromone trail. Then it exits and enters again, and for a fixed time runs around randomly and counts the number of times it crosses its own pheromone trail. You can do that because you can play a pheromone trail. Probably not even perceive it. But here's a simple rule of thumb that does amazingly well. So the cognitive capacities are often the reason why the rules are simple. The rules are not just simple by itself, but they're simple relative to what evolution and learning has given us. So, the study here is done mostly by theoretical ideas and experimental thinking and observational studies. That's done by mathematical analysis and computer simulation. And intuitive design means really go out in the wild and work with people. I will give you a few examples. And since dealing with uncertainty is basically most what happens in the world outside, the distinctive feature of our research is that we work with doctors, we work with financial investors, we work with lawyers, with judges, with many people outside, because the heuristic research really is useful to apply it. Okay, the rest of the talk will go through these 3 points. And let's start with the adaptive toolbox. Here I have a quote from Reinhard Selten, who says, "There's no probability in utility book in the brain which can be looked up like a telephone directory." This is very much against the received wisdom that people at least behave as if they would have probability and utility book in that vein. I personally have, it's one of the beautiful theories which don't ring with my own intuitions. I have no utilities, numerical utilities that are multiplied with probabilities in order to make decisions. So it's as if. Here are some of the classes of heuristics in the Adaptive Toolbox we have studied. Recognition, I will get some examples in this week. And I'll just want to point out recognition heuristic, you'll probably know some of this heuristic fluency. They use the capacity of the human mind to quickly recognize names, recognize faces and others, and on top of that, make inferences. The big question that we face is, namely, how to get a good classification system of the heuristics. Here they are classified by underlying capacities, and how to get a good classification system for the building blocks from which they consist, and maybe you can help us. So that's the big theoretical question here. Some of the interesting results are that we have been able to show that these heuristics, when they are ecologically rational, used in a situation that matches their structure, then they often can perform better than so-called rational or optimal or rational choice models that use all the information. And we will see in a minute what are the reasons for that. So here's the first big question. Can we find something that is akin to the periodic table of elements in order to structure the heuristics in a better way? So would be, for instance, are there more than 100 heuristics as there are in the periodic table of elements? Can we reduce them to a few particles like protons and electrons that would correspond to the search rules and stopping rules? Is that possible? This is still one of the questions that keeps us sleepless. And I hope maybe a few of you too, because that's the way to make progress. To get headaches and stomach aches and just to fight with some ideas. I give you just one example that illustrates the difference between a world of risk and a world of uncertainty, and the question, how can we make, now the normative question, how can we make better decisions in both of these worlds? I take the example from finance. Assume you made an inheritance. So you have lots of money and you want to invest it. You don't want to put everything into one basket. You want to diversify. But how? Harry Markowitz from the University of Chicago got his Nobel Prize in economics for the solution. It's the so-called mean variance model. The problem is not, of this model, is not the calculations. It's the estimations of the expected means, of the expected variances of the entire covariance matrix. That's the problem. So when I use the term complex model, I don't mean complex calculations. I mean complex estimations. In the sense that if you have small data, or if the world is not very stable, you just miss it. That's the point. Okay, when Harry Markowitz made his own investment for the time after his retirement, he used his Nobel Prize winning strategy. So we might think, no, he did not. He used a simple heuristic that's known as 1/n. Allocate your money equally to each of the n funds. So if you have 2, then 50-50. If you have 3, a third. You can do this in a second. For the Markowitz modeling, you need years and years of stock data in order to estimate the parameters and make your allocations. There are now a number of studies out that have compared how well 1/n works compared to Markowitz optimization or to other complex investment systems. In one of these studies, there were 7 investment problems. One of these is to invest your money in 10 American industrial funds. And the Markowitz method got 10 years of stock data to estimate its parameters. What was the result? According to common indicators such as shock ratio, in 6 out of 7 cases, 1/n made more money than the optimization method. Now, the point is not that more is better, and the point is not that less is more. The real point is the ecological rationality question. Can we identify the world in which 1/n, that means ignoring all the data, pays? And can we identify the world in which the computations pay? And here is our 3 hypotheses. First, if the uncertainty, meaning the predictability and the stability of this problem is low, if you only have few alternatives, that means you only have to estimate a few parameters, and lots of data make it complex. In this case, go for mean variance. If there's high uncertainty, as in the stock market, if you have many alternatives and relatively small amount of data, then go for heuristics. Make it simple. So this is all qualitative, and you can do this. Put this in a quantitative question. So, for instance, if you have 50 stocks or 50 alternatives, how many years of stock data would you need in order so that the estimates, the parameter estimates, get as stable so that the mean variance model will be better, or it can be expected to be better than 1/n. Remember that in this study, 10 years was too little. How many years do you think you need?
100 years.
Yeah, here someone is. This is my test whether someone read the paper. So. Good, you did. So the best estimates, and these are estimates based on computer simulation, of 500 years. So in the year 2500, people can stop relying on their intuitions, and they will do probably better with the making the calculations, provided the same stocks are still around and the stock market in the first place. So I've been working with a number of banks. If you think that the bankers understand that idea of ecological rationality, most not. So that is an illustration of a program that tries to identify structures of world in which a simple heuristic is better. Remember, according to the Kahneman heuristics and biases program, a simple heuristic can never be better than rational choice, whatever that is. So we, in a world, and that's true in a world of risk, but we now understand more. In a world of uncertainty, that's not necessarily true. And here we ask the question, can we describe the world where less is more? As I mentioned at the beginning, risk and uncertainty are usually confused. In everyday language, we use it as synonyms, and you find lots of books which say this is about decision making under uncertainty, and if you look closer, the probabilities are known, everything is known. Yeah? It's really about certainty. The confusion between risk and uncertainty, in the sense that you think you can calculate something and predict it, although you can't, is in philosophy since 1912 known as the turkey illusion. And I'll brought one example of a turkey illusion for you. every year, end of the year, the large banks in the world make predictions about the euro-dollar exchange rate for the end of next year. Here are 22 banks that make these predictions every year, and they are bought for, in part, lots of money by managers who want to know how the business will go. In this list you have everything that is famous and infamous. JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Deutsche Bank, UBS, and everything. So I try to find out how good these predictions are. And I'll show you the result. Here is the exchange rate. 1.0 means $1, €1. Up here means euro is stronger, down, dollar is stronger. Every point is a prediction of one of these 22 banks. The circle is the average. In December 2000, the predictions were made for December 2001. And here you see that there's quite a spread of over 20 cents. And on average, the prediction was that $1 will cost €1. For instance, the Deutsche Bank predicted that. What was the actual exchange rate a year later? Where do you think? Robbie? It was lower than all predictions except one, that was Citibank, now Citigroup, and it was the last time Citigroup was lucky in its 10 years. Assume you are a high-paid Wall Street analyst, or Frankfurt, or City of London analyst. What do you do now when you make the predictions for next year? Do you go up or down? You go down. That's what they did. You might think about switching to a better paid job. What did the exchange rate do? Went up. Note, outside the entire range of predictions. What would you do if you see that and make your predictions? You go up now. Yes, that's what I did. What did the exchange rate do? Went up again. Second time, outside of the range of the prediction. What do you do now? Yeah, you know it. You go up. Again, outside. So by now, you probably sensed what the mathematical models do. We do not know what the mathematical models are because they're kept secret and sold for lots of money because they make so valuable predictions. But basically, they predict that the trend next year will be the same as last year. So you know now what the predictions will be. They go up, and the exchange rate goes down, so they go down, and the exchange rate goes up. At least the first time somehow within the range of predictions. And now they go up, and the exchange rate goes up further, outside again. So they go up, and the exchange rate goes down. The first hit in the 10 years, and also the last one. And then they go down, the exchange rate goes up. So they go up, and the exchange rate goes down. That's called the turkey illusion. It means you try to use standard probability models to predict something you can't predict. And it creates an illusion of certainty. The question is, why are these predictions still bought? And why are people eager to read them? The same happens with stock predictions. They're not better. There are two answers. One is, most people don't know how bad these predictions are. And you probably have never seen this before, and there's good reasons why the banks don't show you that. The second answer is more interesting. The top managers who buy these predictions have a good intuitive sense that these predictions are not very good, but they want to buy them nevertheless. Why? The reason is defensive decision making. If you use your own intuitions, and you're wrong, it's your responsibility. But if you pay the Deutsche Bank for these predictions, and the predictions are wrong, it's not your responsibility, it's the Deutsche Bank. In my own research, much of decision making in our society, in politics, in business, and also in your doctor's office, is going more and more defensive. It's no longer about finding the best decision. It's about protecting yourself, cover your ass. That's the motto. So if you think that your doctor will advise you the best thing to do, then you may be lucky to have the right doctor. But many doctors do not advise you the best thing, but they advise you something that protects themselves against you, the patient, as a potential plaintiff. In the US, there's a study that had asked over 800 doctors in high litigation, under high danger of litigation, like gynecologists, like surgeons, and brain surgeons, whether they practice defensive medicine. What proportion do you think said yes? Were there Americans here? Who of you is from the United States? So that's your country. Okay, what do you think?
Close to 100% probably.
Over 100?
No, close to it.
Okay, and you?
I'll go with 40%.
Yeah. Anyone else?
80-90%.
50-50 is always good, yeah. So. Okay, the answer was 93% said that they practice defensive decision making, and that's probably an underestimate because not everyone admits it to you, the interviewer, or to himself. So you got the prize. Okay, so here is lots of psychology. Defensive decision making is almost no topic in judgment decision making. One of the reasons for that is that that much of the judgment decision making is individualistic. So it doesn't look at the person and the environment, and all the causes for all disasters are sought inside the person, without realizing the social games being played. So I move on to the second point, ecological rationality. So here I use a definition that Peter Todd and I introduced in the Simple Heuristics book. A heuristic is ecological rational to the degree that it is adapted to the structure of the environment. That's not very precise. It's a perspective. The precision in the answer comes from analyzing the specific structures. I showed you before a few. So the degree of stability, the sample size, the number of parameters you need to estimate. And Herbert Simon once used his now famous analogy to explain behavior, how to explain behavior, and a pair of scissors. Basically saying, behavior is a function of the inside and the outside. So the environment and the cognition, and you will fail to understand human behavior and its rationality if you just look at one side. And most of the explanations in psychology, including behavioral economics, are just inside. So your behavior is attributed to you being risk averse. That's just inside. There's no ecological rationality question being asked when it's a good idea to be and when not. Or to having certain preferences and other things. This is one of the big challenges, to think the questions in a different way. How can we understand behavior as a function of both, say, heuristics and the environment? That's the question. And Ralph Hertwig will tomorrow give you a few examples about how very complex behaviors and amazing behaviors are best understood as a function of a very simple heuristic and changing environments. The general way to understand the normative question. So when we started out in 1995, we discovered that a simple heuristic such as take the best or tallying can sometimes make better predictions than a multiple regression. That was stunning. And at this time, I don't remember anyone who believed that. And the common perception was it can't be true. You used the wrong regression. And then we use all kinds of regressions. And a few of the pioneers are here. Laura Martineau, for instance, who started out to do all this, the mathematical, part of the mathematical work. And so we were puzzled. And the question was, how can we explain that in this situation a simple heuristic does better with less information compared to, say, a logistic regression that has all the information and uses more computation. And at the beginning, there were a few mathematical theorems that you may be aware of. And I'll give just one explanation that's more general, and that Henry Brighton will explain in more detail today. But I chose it in my talk because I know that, as important that is, it's often better to have a slight repetition of important ideas so they stick. Here is the typical account that you will read today in almost every book in behavioral economics or philosophy or in psychology about why people use heuristic. Why? Because we make a trade-off. The trade-off is between accuracy and effort. So a heuristic is simpler to use, like trust your doctor. But you may suffer a little bit from compared to the optimal, that's the accuracy, or in the predictions. And that's based on the idea that the error that you want to avoid has only two components. One is the bias, this is the biases in our minds, that we just look at one good reason and ignore the rest, that's in the view, and then the noise. So we don't deal with the noise, that's this view. But in prediction, this is not a complete analysis. The moment you go into the world of uncertainty, then a very different trade-off is the answer. It's called the Bias-Variance Tradeoff. And you see the total error is bias, that's still in. Noise, yes, but there's something else. It's called variance. I'll explain it with a simple example. So variance is, in a way, the overly sensitivity of methods that estimate parameters to basically the noise in the data. Here's an example. 365 points, every one is the average temperature in London in the year 2000. Assume that could be anything. That could be market indices, there could be other things that vary on a daily basis. You want to find out what's the underlying function. And here you have two. You have a polynomial of third degree and one of 12th degree. A polynomial of first degree is a line. A polynomial, not a good model for weather in London. It might work in the equator. Polynomial second degree is a parabola, also not a good model because it never gets warm again. And third degree at least comes back. The important distinction I want to draw your attention to is between fitting data and prediction. Which one of the two models, the more complex one, complex in the sense that it has to estimate more parameters, or the simpler one, fits the data better? What do you think?
The complex one.
Yeah. And do you know how you could fit the data perfectly?
More problems.
Yes, how many do you need? Yeah, you need a polynomial. I think 364 is enough, yeah? and then you can draw a line through every point, or the winner. this is data fitting. And you can see with this example that data fitting is not interesting to model people, because a good fit means hindsight, enormous powers of hindsight. But what we need to do is to predict the future. So in general, the fit gets better the more complex your model is. So this is error, and low is better. You see a 1 degree polynomial, a line has lots of error. It gets better. You saw the 3 one, and you saw the 12 one. Now the question is, but how good is each of these models now fitted in prediction? And prediction, you can do it in the following way. You take samples from the entire population of 365, or you can just you predict next year's. You will find the same structure. So what do you think? How does the curve for prediction look like?
Bit like a logistical, exponential function.
So it goes.
It goes up.
The big question is, does it also go in the same direction, so that more is always better?
No. The other
No,
way.
it goes up all the time?
No.
No?
It drops at the beginning.
Yeah. It's U-shaped. This is a typical result. That gives you an idea why simpler can be better in an uncertain world. In the world of fitting, there is no uncertainty because you know every data point. But in prediction, from sample to population, or from 1 year to another year, you get that kind of relationship typically. So that means you need, in this case, a model that's sufficiently simple. And the interesting point in this example is that a model that has a high bias. So bias means, for instance, a line, a linear model, it has a high bias. It's a really bad model for temperature in London. Yeah, basically, this way. But it has low variance because it just needs to estimate few parameters. So this is a polynomial degree 1. Compared to a model that has low bias but high variance. So the higher bias model is measured by error better than this one, which is closer to the truth in terms of having no bias. Henry Brighton will, the day after tomorrow, talk about this Bias-Variance Dilemma. And the general point is to understand why less can be more, is in situations where the bias and heuristics typically have more bias than a linear model, say, that has all the information. The question is, how can we create enough bias so that we reduce the other error due to being overly sensitive to the specific sample size? If you understand that, then you also understand that for a human mind it's necessary, the moment you are in an uncertain world, to have bias. Bias is not something that you should get down to zero. That's not the case. So you need biases, like, for instance, when I made my decision how to go to academia, just use one good reason. That can often be much better than do a linear regression. And you actually can show that, given the uncertainty in this world. And how do you get biases? So here are 3 ways. One is equal weights. And we had an example, 1 over n. Now 1 over n, now think in terms. 1 over n doesn't have to estimate any parameters. Does it have bias? Yes. So whatever the end result will be, it will probably not match it. Does it have variance? No. It has no error from variance. So the bet is on that the bias that it has is smaller than the bias in the variance Markowitz has. That's basically the bet. And then we can study exactly when we can expect that and when not. Another way to introduce bias is ignoring other reasons, like one good reason decision making, and lexicographic heuristics, which introduce bias by ignoring the dependency between reasons. And that's the last thing I show you. A few examples for this kind of lexicographic means are basically sequential search heuristics. Two examples. One from our project with the Bank of England, simple heuristics for a safer world of finance. You know the background, we had a financial crisis. One of the reasons of the financial crisis were the mathematics, so the optimization models used. In a world where optimization is an illusion. But models like value at risk have been used to estimate its standard probability theory, used in the wrong domain, so with high uncertainty and instability. That's another case of the Turkey illusion. And here, what's the alternative? And we work since a few years with the Bank of England on the project Simple Heuristics for a Safer World. So they use simpler methods to create more safety instead of complex models which create lots of error. So value at risk has missed every crisis, predicted none, and prevented none. Still, the banks go on to make these calculations. And the alternative is, if you're interested, then read Andy Haldane's, who is the Executive Director of Financial Stability at the Bank of England. That's his first report of our research at the dog and the frisbee. That's one of the heuristics that you may have read about, the case heuristic. And it was arguing in the Jackson Hole meeting that we need to change. We need to investigate when these complex models used actually work, and when we need to find or look for something that's simpler and therefore better and safer. And certainly a central bank like the Bank of England can see that they're being gained much easier if the rules are simple rather than complex. Here's an example. I don't go into details. This is called a fast-and-frugal tree. There will be a talk by Shenghua Luan, who will explain in detail how fast-and-frugal trees work. That's a heuristic. It's an incomplete tree. It ignores everything else. And it has, for binary decisions, exactly n plus 1 exits. N is the number of questions asked. That's the tree. And the point here is only the structure of the tree. I don't go into details. So if the leverage ratio, which is basically the ratio between your capital and your debts in simple terms, it is smaller than a certain threshold, then immediately a red flag. So the question is to detect vulnerable banks. For instance, if before the financial crisis, one would have evaluated UBS with this model, UBS had a leverage ratio of around 2-point-something%, would immediately gone into a red flag, despite UBS would have succeeded in every of the other ones. But these models are non-compensatory. So if you fail on that, that's it. Okay. A linear model might let pass UBS because there are other things, but not these type of models. And then the question is, in what world is this character, like there's one dominant negative reason, the better thing to do than have everything compensated. So that's one illustration of this kind of models. How good are they? Here's a first analysis. This is a so-called ROC curve. So here we have the hit rate, and we want to be up there, and it's the false alarm rate. In this case, wrongly putting a bank into the vulnerability question. You want to have something that's up here, and that's the change line. You don't want to be in this area. So the tree that we just saw is this green circle. It does quite good compared to other and standard things. And we are trying to figure out how we can improve, how we can design these trees, how we can understand where they work. So this is a positive use of heuristics in an uncertain world. Second example, reducing civilian casualties, and it's simply heuristics for another problem in the decision-making in the wild, checkpoints. So in many places in the world, military controls are like in a checkpoint, and a car is coming at a high speed, and they need to make a decision within seconds, should they shoot or not? Is it a terrorist or is it a civilian? How do they do this? That's what's given to soldiers what they should do. That's just a sequence, warning, weapons and intent to use, but it doesn't tell them when they should use that. And the key problem in many parts of the world is that too many civilians are killed by their whatever unstructured decision making. And you can't help them by telling you maximize your expected utility. What should they do? So we designed a tree, a fast and frugal tree that can be used in this situation. And you see, it's again a tree that has now a slightly different structure. And the structure tells you whether to minimize and maximize false alarms versus risks. But the details will be in Xinghua's talk. So does the car have a single occupant? If there are more, immediately bet on a civilian. Terrorists don't come in couples. And is the car approaching at high speed? Then bet on suicide attacker. And otherwise, is there previous information about a certain specific car and so on that decides things? This, our student who did his dissertation work on that was very lucky that WikiLeaks leaked out and could test this tree on the actual data in Afghanistan. And there were about 1,000 incidents, so-called critical incidents, in which 204 civilians were killed or wounded. By using that tree, which was developed independently of the data, so it's not fitting, one could have reduced that number from over 200 to 78. It's an example how to minimize the false alarms. You had a question.
Yeah. Wouldn't the use of this tree, or the use of the tree for the banks, create a situation in which the other side could use, for example, well, the car doesn't have a single occupant, it's a civilian, okay, so terrorists now come in couples, and that's it.
Yeah.
Or the banks.
Yeah.
For example, I know that all I have to do is keep some levels, this is all I keep, 3 levels, and all other actions are hazardous.
Yeah, perfect point, yeah. So the point is not that this tree or the bank tree is perfect. Yeah? The point is, the question is, does it better than what we have? And you see here, it does better than what we have, and not doing anything. Yeah?
For fitting it in, not for predicting it.
No, this is not fitting. That tree was developed with experts like the other one from the German forces, and then tested on the WikiLeaks data. But your point is another one. Could we hear this all the time when we promote simple heuristics for in the kind of investment? Say, simple rules can easily be gained. The answer is yes. But the complex rules in place have been gained all the time. And for a central bank, there is no chance to see how the rules are gained if the rules are so complex. The central banks can see that easier. If there is just a leverage ratio of, say, not higher than 1 to 10 or anything, you can much easier see what's going on than checking a bank's value at risk calculations, which are, just to give you an idea, a large bank has to estimate thousands of parameters. That means a covariance matrix in the order of millions. And they do this with their own internal models. The banks have no chance to check that. So you're right, gaming will happen, but by making it simpler, we can see much easier when something is being gamed. And that's a topic of study. Yes?
But isn't each one of these decision points are actually quite complex by itself? For example, how do we define a high speed? What happens if you use like intelligence information on dozens of targets, and how do you match that into the seconds to decide whether you shoot or not?
Yeah. So high speed was used, so the WikiLeaks data have these terms, high speed or slowed down or other things. That's matched with the data. This tree is maybe, there may be situations where it's hard to find out whether there's 1 or 2 occupants. But given whatever the soldiers do at this point in time, we have good evidence that we could reduce the civilian casualties. And if more people would study these things, then I think we would also understand that better. Let me finish. Here are some of the points I made in this talk. Risk is not the same as uncertainty. The best decision on the risk is not the best decision on the uncertainty. I gave you a few examples. Think about 1 over n. Think about Markowitz optimization. Heuristics are indispensable, not second best. If you have a textbook in social psychology today, you still read that heuristics are second best. At least there is never any doubt that logic or probability theory would be second best. And in more recent time, heuristics have been attributed as part of a so-called flawed or a system one that is responsible for most of the errors. Don't believe that. The general assumption underlying of a general accuracy effort trade-off is incorrect, as I showed you. We need to find out situations where heuristics do better than so-called rational models and where the opposite is the case. That's the study of ecological rationality. And finally, we need biases in order to reduce errors. Biases are not the source of all evil. It's a trade-off between biases that means basically be stubborn and resist to learn something. 1 over n resists to even take account of all the data in the stock market, and being overly sensitive by every new piece of information you get. And that's the healthy mind has a good balance between these 2 types of errors that you can make. And that also explains why less can be more. So, this was a short introduction into the general program of the study of uncertainty and how people use heuristics to do that. It has a descriptive part, the adaptive toolbox, a normative part, the ecological rationality, and an engineering part to go out in the wild and try to help people to make better decisions. Thank you for your attention.